I'm going to give people just a couple minutes to trickle in before I start getting too into anything juicy. So thank you guys for joining us today, and give people a couple minutes to find us here. So I am Dr. Becky Bowling. You're here for another episode of Chat with Green Aggies. We'll just do a quick rundown here and let everybody introduce themselves. Irfan, would you like to introduce yourself real quickly?
Sure. My name is Irfan Vefai with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension based out of Overton, and I'm kind of specialized in entomology and insects.
Dr. Gu?
Oh, hi. My name is Mengmeng Gu. I'm a professor extension specialist in horticulture, in the horticulture department here in College Station.
Laura?
Sure, I'm Laura Miller, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Agent for Commercial Horticulture in Tarrant County.
Paul?
And I'm Paul Winsky, Commercial Horticulture Agent here in Harris County.
And again, I am Dr. Becky Bowling. I am an extension specialist for urban water at the Dallas Center. I was the state turfgrass extension specialist for about 2 years, so you may know me from that, depending on what you've joined us for before. Today we are going to talk about a variety of different things, starting with controlling cool season weeds or controlling weeds in winter. And I've kind of framed this around weeds in turf in particular, but many of these same principles can be applied to other areas of the landscape as well. I am going to keep the chat window open, so if you're joining us on the Zoom version of this, feel free to include questions in the chat and I will try to address those as we go along. If you're joining us on Facebook, I will try to be sure that I go and look at some of those questions on the Facebook page later on, and we can try to get some of those addressed in writing. So, you know, this is kind of a little bit of a blurry picture, but one of the things that we kind of face as a challenge when we're thinking about winter weeds is when we get the introduction of these weeds into our turf grass areas, you know, they start to germinate right around this time of year. I will share with you that in College Station, Texas, we actually have a research study ongoing right now looking at the germination and emergence of one winter weed in particular, Poa annua or annual bluegrass, and I'll show you guys a picture of that one here in a little bit if you're not familiar with it. We're already seeing that germinate in very large flushes in College Station. We've kind of had some cooler weather a little bit earlier this year, in contrast to last year where we had very hot, dry September, October in many parts of the state. And when these winter weeds initially come up, a lot of times they go almost unnoticed in our turf and landscape areas. We're still distracted a lot of times by lingering summer weeds. We've got residual crabgrass, goosegrass, Dallas grass, things that have been giving us a headache for the past several months that they're still kind of catching our eye, even though they're starting to wind down their growth cycle. Meanwhile, these winter annuals and winter perennial weeds that are coming up are small. They're relatively easy to ignore. A lot of times as we progress through the winter, we're a little bit less preoccupied with the health and appearance of our turf grass. Depending on where you are in the state, your turf grass may start to go dormant during this time, or at the very least, a lot of its growth has slowed. And so we may not think as much about winter weeds early in the season. And unfortunately, that is the most critical time for controlling a lot of these weeds. And we end up kind of ignoring them until the following spring, when all of a sudden they're very large, mature, they're producing flowers, seeds, burrs in some cases, and they now are competing with our warm season turf grass that's trying to green back up for the spring. And so now it's a real issue. And so this is a really good time of year to think about how do we protect our turf grass and landscape areas from these weeds early on. We'll talk a little bit about pre-emergence herbicide control, which we've touched on in a couple of other Chat with Green Aggie programs recently. And we'll talk about early season post-emergence control, as well as integrated weed management practices that we can integrate. I did want to take a few moments to kind of talk about some of the superstars of the winter weed world. So here's one that I get a lot of complaints about every spring. This is burr clover. So we have a lot of different weeds here in Texas that produce burrs, and they may be generally described as burr weeds. We have another winter annual weed called lawn burr weed that also produces burrs. This one is going to be a legume. It's actually it's not a true clover, it's actually a medic. But it produces that kind of, three-leaved, has that three-leafed leaf arrangement that we're familiar with on a lot of our clovers. And it's not so bad looking, when it's in this stage, but it does start to produce those little burrs that get caught in our pet's hair and get snagged on our clothing, especially when we get into the spring. So this is one that a lot of people get very frustrated with. Another common winter annual weed is going to be henbit, which is in the mint family. This is one that I actually think is kind of pretty, but may not go with our desired look of our landscape and can sometimes get more invasive than we would like for it to be. And again, while these weeds may not pose an immediate threat to anything during the winter months, if they're allowed to become very mature, they can be in direct competition with our turf and other landscape areas in the early spring. Here's one called annual bluegrass, or Poa annua. This is a very invasive winter annual grass, germinates right around now, begins to take over a lot of areas in the landscape, tends to like moist soils, somewhat shady conditions. It's very adaptable. In fact, this particular weed can be found on every single continent on the planet, including Antarctica. It was introduced to the maritime regions of Antarctica, and they actually have some research studies showing that it's moving into the tundra. So it adapts very readily. We also, with this particular weed, have seen that it is able to develop herbicide resistance. In other words, the products that we try to use to control it may become increasingly less effective, especially if we're not using those products properly. And that's become a real issue with this weed. We can actually see that annual bluegrass can develop herbicide resistance in as little as about 2 to 3 years, depending on how intensively we're using a product. And once those biotypes, those resistant biotypes exist in our system, it can be very, almost impossible to ever remove that from our population. So that's a real issue that we face. Another winter annual grass that's very common in a lot of our Texas landscapes is going to be rescue grass. This is one that I get in my backyard quite a bit. And if I keep it mowed, it actually doesn't look so bad, but it will get kind of large and coarse if we kind of let it go unmaintained, and it can be very aggressive in some cases. And you may recognize these seed heads. A lot of times we may not know what types of grassy weeds we're dealing with until they finally produce seed heads at the end of the season. So you may look for these seed heads next spring as an identification of, in order to identify this particular weed. Annual ryegrass is one that sometimes we plant on purpose as an overseed option of our warm season turfgrass areas, and other times it will show up as a weed. Here's what the seed head looks like for that over here in the lower right-hand corner. This one also is a distinctive identifying characteristic. It produces fairly long clasping auricles, which are these little protrusions that come around the collar where the leaf connects, the blade connects to the stem. And you'll see those little things kind of wrapping themselves around the stem. That's one trait that we can use to identify annual ryegrass. Common groundsel is one that, may look a little bit like a dandelion to us. It's not dandelion, but it's in that same family. It's in the Senecio. It's in the Senecio genus, and so it's going to produce this little cluster of little yellow composite flowers. We may see the rosettes showing up right about now, and they'll start to bolt as we get deeper into the season. So when we're thinking about all of these weeds, that maybe we haven't thought about since last spring, but they're coming. Winter is coming. We do want to make sure that we always have a plan for integrated weed management, whether you're managing a private landscape or you're a professional managing multiple landscapes or a professional operation. We've talked about integrated pest management quite a bit on here before, but I do want to make sure I review before we get too deep into talking about chemical control and some of those other things. So we want to make sure that we have a good preventative control program. This is where we're responsible about the types of things that we bring in or introduce into the landscape, being aware of the fact that things like seed sod, compost materials, mulch materials can contain weed seed or small parts of weeds like rhizomes and stolons that can introduce weeds into a landscape area. Preventative control can also refer to keeping our equipment clean, recognizing that mowers, for example, can transport weeds from one infested area to a non-infested area. So being mindful of that as well. Having good cultural control practices in place, this means that we're taking steps to bolster the health of the plants in our landscape and the soil in our landscape to make it a less favorable environment for weeds, and encouraging our desired plants to be more competitive with weeds through appropriate irrigation, fertilization, and cultivation practices. This is a time of year where a lot of people hurt themselves because they continue to keep their irrigation running. They continue to fertilize very heavily this time of the year, even though a lot of our landscape plants, and in particular our turf grass areas, are starting to really wind down for the year. So at this point in the season, typically I tell people your automated irrigation does not need to be on anymore. Doesn't mean that you can't turn the irrigation on as needed for certain things, but it should be switched over to manual at this point in the year. And you should avoid applying any new nitrogen fertilizer to turf grass areas once you're about 6 weeks before the historic first frost date. If we push too much nitrogen too late in the season, it can promote disease, it can promote a flush of weed growth in our turf, and it can increase the likelihood of winter kill or winter injury. Mechanical control is going to be our go-to for those lingering summer weeds that are still there and are mature. Those more mature established weeds are going to be less responsive to post-emergent weed control at this point in the season. So going in and removing them by hand, or at the very least keeping them mowed and bagging and removing the clippings to prevent seed dispersal can be important. Mechanical control can also refer to maintaining a good mulch barrier in landscape bed areas in order to prevent weeds from coming up. This mulch layer can also help serve as a form of insulation during winter months, and can also during summer months help to trap moisture and reduce evaporative losses. Biological control can refer to the introduction of natural predators to impede weed growth. And we talked on a previous chat with Green Aggies a little bit about some new work and the introduction of some new products into the industry that utilize certain types of bacteria to help serve as a herbicide option and help with weed controls. There's a lot of new work being done in this area in order to have some new options for controlling weeds. And then, of course, chemical control, including the use of natural and synthetic herbicides, pre- and post-emergence herbicides, systemic and contact herbicides. So a herbicide is a substance that's toxic to plants and used to destroy unwanted vegetation. This term, again, can be used to encompass both synthetic products as well as more natural or organic products. I did want to take a moment just to review these terms because I'm going to talk about some of them. So, systemic herbicides are going to refer to those herbicides that are absorbed by the foliage or roots and translocated throughout the plant. This is going to be typically what we're going to want to look at, particularly for more established weeds, so very large, mature weeds, and perennial weeds. Okay, so if you're dealing in the landscape with something like nut sedges, Dallas grass, etc., these are weeds that form rhizomes or tubers or other things underground, and we need a herbicide that's able to translocate into those plant parts for total control. Contact herbicides are going to control only those parts of the plant that they come into contact with. We have synthetic versions of contact herbicides, which will include things like glufosinate, and if you're a professional, that's things like phenolate or cheetah. It also includes diquat, okay? And all of our organic herbicides also fall into this category of contact herbicides. Organic herbicides will not translocate through plant material. Then we have selective and non-selective herbicides. Selective herbicides are those that are formulated to control specific weeds or weed categories. So in theory, these are products that we could broadcast application on the turf grass area without harming the turf. Non-selective herbicides are going to be those that control things indiscriminately. They're not picky about what they kill or control. And then finally, we have pre- and post-emergence herbicides. Pre-emergence herbicides are going to refer to those herbicides that interfere with the seedling germination and emergence process. So you may be familiar with some of these. Dithiopyr, which is dimension. pendimethalin, which is pendulum, prodiamine, which is barricade, and dazaflam, which is spectacle. We also have some box store formulations of some of those active ingredients available more to homeowners. And then post-emergence herbicides are going to be those products that we use for weed control following the emergence of a weed. We do have some herbicides that have both pre and post-emergence activity, okay? But a lot of times, you know, we may think of these as being relatively separate categories. Every product that we use, every pesticide product that we use has a unique mode of action. And in the case of herbicides, increasingly we're seeing more of the term site of action used as a way of distinguishing between different products. So pesticide products are classified by this mode of action or site of action, or the specific part of that pest that they target in their activity to get control. And this is important, particularly as professionals, that we understand you know, how to distinguish between different modes of action. So in the case of herbicides, when we're looking at a product label, we're able to see that group number. A lot of times they'll use the WSSA, the Weed Science Society of America group number, as a numerical designation for a particular site or mode of action for that product. And we want to make sure that when we're building a herbicide program or a chemical control program, that we have a plan for rotating the types of products that we're using so that we prevent herbicide resistance from occurring. A lot of times, I mean, I would say that this has been something that has not been maybe as much of a priority in turf and ornamental weed management as it should be. You know, this is something that's been a big concern in agronomic production, and I think is becoming gradually an increasing concern in more urban landscape management, as we are seeing more and more weeds in these turf and ornamental environments that are developing herbicide resistance. This means that those chemical control options are no longer working, either because we've relied too much on one mode of action over time, or we're using that product inappropriately, meaning we're using it at the wrong rates, we're using it at the wrong time, and, you know, or sometimes this resistance is naturally occurring in the form of a mutation in the weed. And so rotating our modes of action, rotating the sites of action is important to prevent herbicide resistance from occurring when we're talking about weed management. So we really want to be mindful of that. This is especially, you know, I would just say Poa annua, annual bluegrass, is especially susceptible, we're finding, to herbicide resistance. And so when you're thinking about a winter weed program, this is something you really want to think about, especially as professionals. How can I rotate the modes of action for the pre-emergence herbicides I'm using and the post-emergence herbicides that I'm using? So, you know, pre-emergence herbicides are typically going to be the most effective on annual weeds. You know, we've talked about this some in some other programs. So when we're talking about summer annual weeds, these are going to be the most effective on crabgrass and goosegrass and similar summer annuals. And they'll also be very effective on winter annuals like annual bluegrass. And many of the weeds that we talked about at the beginning are actually annuals. And different products will have different efficacy on some of those weeds. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Pre-emergence herbicides can be helpful with select perennial weeds, but they really need to be combined with a post-emergence program, because once those perennial weeds are established and they're no longer coming back from seed, you know, many of these pre-emergence products just may not be designed to really be impactful on those plants that are coming back from other things. We also want to remember that, you know, a lot of our options for post-emergence weed control of grassy weeds in turf grass are more limited. Turf grass and grassy weeds are more similar physiologically, and this can be more limiting in terms of products that can be effective without harming our turf grass. And so having a strong pre-emergence program in place can be especially important when we're dealing with grassy weeds, particularly annual grasses. We've talked a little bit about timing and application and some recent other programs, so I won't get into that too much today other than a little bit of review, and I'm going to share some new data with you guys. So a lot of times, you know, we base pre-emergence herbicide timing on the soil temperatures at which particularly problematic weeds germinate. So, you know, in the spring, We're focused a lot on crabgrass and goosegrass. In the fall, we may be more focused on Poa annua or annual bluegrass. Depending on where you're joining from in Texas, there may be other weeds that aren't on here at all that are your primary problem, and those may germinate at very different soil temperatures than what we see here. You know, so for example, if I'm looking, here's a few other weeds, and you'll just kind of see that on average, they tend to germinate at different times, different soil temperatures. And so this is something that we have to take into consideration when we're designing an effective pre-emergence herbicide program. So this is some data from, I mentioned a study that we're conducting right now. It's a part of the USDA SCRI project that's looking at the herbicide resistance epidemic in annual bluegrass in turf grass systems across the country. So we have, 17 faculty from all over the country that are looking at this one particular weed, annual bluegrass, and trying to understand what are the mechanisms for resistance, what are the traits of this weed, what is the pattern of when it emerges and germinates, and how can we use all of this to develop more effective programs for controlling it. And so one thing that we have been doing here in Texas is we've actually been looking at the emergence of annual bluegrass in 2 locations. One of those locations is in College Station, and the other is going to be in Brenham. So they're only about an hour apart from each other, but they're technically in different hardiness zones and have some different characteristics. And so what we have noticed is in the case of our more southern zone, which is in Brenham, last year we actually observed a bimodal pattern of seedling emergence. So what this means is we had 2 primary peaks of emergence occur throughout the season. Okay, one of those was in early November, and again, a lot of that had to do with the fact that we had some warmer, drier weather last year, so we didn't see a lot of POA germination and emergence until a little bit later in the season, whereas this year we've already got quite a bit of it coming up. And then we saw another flush in January, okay? Now, this is important because a lot of times when we're developing a pre-emergence control program, we make that first application for our fall pre-emergent typically, when our soil temperatures drop to around 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is typically going to fall sometime between September or October, depending on where we are geographically and just the weather that we have that year. And if I go back, if I put that product out in September, October, maybe it helps to protect me against this initial flush. But depending on the product that I choose, that product may have long worn off before I get this second potential flush of germination and emergence later on in the season. And so, what this means particularly for a professional. So let's say I'm watching from a golf course, or I'm a professional landscape manager, or what have you, especially if I'm in a more southern region of the state where I have milder winter weather conditions. What I may have to look at is a split or sequential pre-emergent application in order to broaden my window of control across the winter and protect against this second potential flush that I may get. And in order to do this, you'll want to read and follow the label. The label will be very specific as to how to implement this type of program. Each product will be different in terms of the maximum annual use rate that we can get away with, and whether or not that frees us up to do, a sequential application where we do a full rate 2 times at a specified interval on the label, or whether we have to do a split application where we divide that rate in half, apply the first half here, and apply the second half here. Okay, so again, following the product label in order to implement that. And we also do have some pre-emergence herbicide products that are going to just naturally have a little bit longer residual window of activity. So indaziflam or Spectacle is one such product where we may naturally get more prolonged activity in the soil compared with some other pre-emergence herbicide products. So that's just something to keep in mind. If we have an especially mild winter, if you're in South Texas, you may have to modify your approach to dealing with some of these winter weeds, recognizing that we just don't get as cold and there may be a second flush of germination and emergence, especially if there's a really, really pronounced seed bank that has built up there over time. I see a couple questions in the chat, and I'll be sure I get to them here in just a little bit. So again, a lot of times what we see for a pre-emergence herbicide program is going to be these 2 applications that are made, one in the spring and one in the fall. And you know, we have a very diverse audience watching this today. And I would say if you're a homeowner or you're a master gardener, this program is probably going to be sufficient for you to meet your goals for your landscape. Now, if you're a professional, depending on the expectations for the area you're managing, you may need to look at something that's a little bit more aggressive, where you're applying almost on a quarterly basis, or you're making 2 applications each in the spring and the fall, or maybe you do 3 applications where you make 1 in the spring and 2 in the fall, or 1 in the fall and 2 in the spring. Just depending on the weeds that you're dealing with and the products that you're using, in order to really create a protective barrier against all of those weeds as you move throughout the course of the season. And again, in particular in winter, kind of taking into consideration where you are geographically and how severe those winter conditions are going to be. This is a list of some of the common active ingredients that we find in pre-emergence herbicide products. This particular list here is catered more toward a general public audience, and I will share a link with our more professional audience. I see a request for that in the Zoom chat here. But a lot of these active ingredients can be found in both. We will have some additional actives that are not on this list that may be used in very specific turf systems like sod production, but may not be able to be used in other turf systems. So a lot of different options on here. From an organic standpoint right now, we really have just this one option, corn gluten meal, although I know that Mung mentioned some work to me, and I'll let her speak on that in a little bit about mustard seed. And then I also know, again, that there's some work being done in developing products that use biologicals as a kind of natural pre-emergent control. A lot of these others on here, prodiamine, pendimethalin, dithiopyr, those are all going to be group 3 microtubule assembly inhibitors. So we're talking about the mode of action again. And what that means is they essentially interfere with cell division when the plant is trying to develop and emerge out of the soil. So, you know, that's going to be a few products that we have at our disposal. Here's where we can find them if we're looking for them in box store products. And then again, if I'm a professional, you know, I've got Barricade here, Pendulum here, dithiopyr is going to be Dimension, okay? We talked in a previous chat with Green Aggies about Corteva's new premix product, which combines dithiopyr and isoxaben, okay? Now, isoxaben, which the trade name for this is Gallery, is going to have some improved efficacy on broadleaf weeds. So if you are the landscape that's dealing with burr clover, common groundsel, henbit, etc., adding isoxaben to your pre-emergence herbicide program could be really beneficial in increasing that kind of weed barrier that you have against broadleaf weeds, but it's not going to offer you that same grassy weed control, so you're going to want to combine it with something else like a dithiopyr, or pendimethalin, or prodiamine, okay? Indaziflam, which is the trade name is Spectacle, is going to offer a pretty broad spectrum of pre-emergent control. It's going to have a little bit more restrictions around use and who can use this product compared to some others, although it is now in one weed and feed product, okay? So Spectacle is a nice option. For those of you that are homeowners, master gardeners watching, I would just say briefly that, you know, particularly for winter weed control, I would probably discourage the use of weed and feed products, especially as we get deeper into the winter months. You're adding fertilizer at a time that's not generally going to be considered appropriate for your turf. This can feed disease and other issues and is not really benefiting your turf at all. So just being mindful of that and maybe focusing on using just a herbicide product There's a question in the chat here from Aaron asking, is isoxaben safe on roses? So Aaron, what I would do is if you use that product, review the label. It'll be very specific about what you can use that product around. For a lot of these pre-emergence herbicides, they are generally considered safe to use around established plant material. But because this does have increased activity on broadleaf plants, I would want to review the label before I give you too much of an answer on that. So, you know, feel free, you can download a PDF copy of the gallery label, and you can actually search a lot of those labels. They're generally searchable. So you can search the word rose or roses on that label and see exactly what that product label says. Or I'm happy to follow up with you and show you how to do that if you just shoot me an email. So there is a free pre-emergence herbicide guide available for anybody that's interested in it, that kind of talks about this and when and how to use those. Again, we want to make sure that we don't exceed the maximum annual use rate for any of these products, because it can create issues with our turf grass areas. Okay. Now, in terms of post-emergence weed control, you know, in general, we know that the earlier we treat weeds, the better. Okay, so, you know, when winter annual weeds are small and largely vegetative and before they start to flower and produce seed, that's when a lot of our post-emergence herbicide products are going to be the most effective. So this requires that we're out there scouting judiciously in the fall and in the early winter in order to treat these early in the season before they start to become more mature and more robust, okay? Sometimes, you know, finding products that combine multiple active ingredients can be helpful in kind of increasing our spectrum of control, but we will want to, of course, follow the label and ensure that that product is safe to use in our particular landscape. And just be aware that, you know, some herbicide products increase we have an increased likelihood of accidentally injuring other plants in the landscape. And I would say, you know, this time of year in particular, something to be cautious about is as we move into the fall and the winter, a lot of times we get a lot more natural rainfall. The soil becomes more saturated. And there are certain herbicide products that when we are experiencing those conditions will move a lot in the soil, and they can potentially harm our trees and shrubs and other plants. And so metsulfuron methyl, which is one active ingredient. It's found in several products like Manor or MSM turf. That product can be potentially harmful to landscape plants if it's applied in those saturated conditions where there's a lot of rainfall. So if you are using herbicides this time of year when things do tend to be wet, we do want to be mindful of that. Read and follow the label. Make sure that we're not applying a product that might do harm to our landscape. There is this other guide that reviews post-emergence herbicide options for homeowners as well, breaks it down by active ingredient, generally talks about relative safety on different turf types. So you can download this from the Aggie Turf website. It's aggieturf.tamu.edu. If you are a professional, these are 9 labels that I like to keep on my desktop. There's a lot of other products out there. I'm not specifically condoning the use of any of these particular products, but this is just kind of a nice spectrum of different active ingredients that focus on different types of weeds. And, you know, if you are a professional, my recommendation is for all of the products that you have, downloading a PDF copy of that label from the product manufacturer distributor and keeping that on your iPad or on your desktop or whatever it is, because many of those labels are searchable. This allows you to find information in the label very quickly when you're using that product frequently on a regular basis. And so it just really opens the door to, you know, making sure that you're always on top of what you need to know when you're using these products, and you're aware of where they can be used and how they can be used. One thing to kind of be mindful of as we move into the winter months is that many of these products not only have a maximum temperature at which they should be used, but they also have a minimum temperature at which they can be used to really be effective. So that can create kind of a challenge sometimes with winter weed control, because, you know, these products may recommend that you're applying them when temperatures exceed 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and we may go through really long periods where we want to control weeds, but we're not in that temperature range. But a lot of times herbicides are going to be more effective when we're dealing with weeds that are actively growing. And so targeting those weeds at temperatures at which growth is most likely occurring for that weed is going to allow us to be more effective with our program. So again, just reviewing and following the label closely can be really helpful there. There is also this time of year, as we move into winter, particularly in North Texas, we may have the luxury of experiencing dormant warm season turf. This can open up the window for some different options for weed control that we may not get when turf is actively growing. We may see that people use glyphosate or Roundup on dormant Bermuda grass or dormant turf to control weeds without significantly injuring or damaging the turf. You do want to be careful because sometimes something looks more dormant than it is, and so we don't want to get too heavy-handed, and we want to be cautious. But this is an option if we're dealing with a particularly severe infestation and we are confident that we're very dormant. That may be a time to add a new tool to the toolbox for controlling some of those severe infestations. Okay, that's what I've got for winter weeds. I see a few questions in here. I'm gonna have to go back up and kind of figure out what has been asked. Mung, while I look for these questions, do you wanna share some of that work on the mustard seed that you told me about?
No.
Okay, never mind then.
I think the mustard seed, the reason I'm saying no is only not for today. I think mustard seed deserve its own glory time. You know,
Okay, we'll treat it as a teaser.
Yes, I should say yes. I will provide certain a research update on the mustard seed meal on herbicide control. I mean, as herbicide. I actually, while you scroll up to the questions, I have a question for you. You mentioned herbicide is toxic, is some chemical toxic to plants, but should we include that? Is toxic not limited just to plants, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. All right.
So any pesticide that we use, organic or synthetic, has the potential to be toxic to a wide range of living things. And so, I always tell people, do your due diligence to understand what you're using, and also never take for granted that just because something is, quote, natural or organic, that means that it is safer. Remember, arsenic is also organic. So is cyanide. And so, we want to be mindful of that. We've talked about this before, some of the quote organic herbicides at our disposal, like acetic acid or vinegar, those actually have a higher risk of acute toxicity to humans than many of our other synthetic herbicide products. They can burn the skin, they can corrode concrete and metal. So no matter what we're doing, we want to understand how it affects the plant, us, other living things, and we want to treat that product with respect and protect ourselves and the environment as much as possible.
So similar to the fact that herbicide does not only kill weeds, so insecticide does not only kill insects, fungicide does not only kill, fungi and stuff. So I guess the point that I want to make is that PPE is very important whenever applying all these, chemicals. All right, thank you.
I like to wear a Tyvek suit as much as possible, so it just looks cool. You look like you're going on a space adventure, people want to know what's going on.
It doesn't look that cool when it's the hot Texas summers and you're like
in the
sweating in there. It's just fog in there.
Because it looks cool, not that it is cool.
Yeah.
You have to, it's better to look cool than to be cool.
To be cool,
I have very, very vivid memories of spraying corn in West Texas with fungicide and coming out of it later and pouring sweat out of my boots. So, yeah.
That's pretty cool.
And there goes all of our viewers. All right.
Hey, Becky, did you want to tackle those questions, or are you just doing it in the chat, or what?
Yeah, so we can definitely tackle some of them. I've tried to share, there were a couple of requests for resources. So I've tried to share a few of those resources. And Marlene asked about a resource for herbicides, pesticides, chemicals. So we do have one handbook specifically for turfgrass through Texas A&M. Another one that I really like is the one that's produced by Purdue, and I can try to go find it here in a little bit and share the link, but that one is really well put together and I really like it, but it is catered more toward the northern region. So that's just something to kind of be mindful of. Hey, Bill's watching, and Bill asked, in another presentation, I talked about indicator weeds. Could some of these weeds be addressed by soil improvement? Yeah, so absolutely. You know, one of the challenges with thinking about indicator weeds in the winter time is that we may get an influx of weeds just as a function of a lot of our other plant materials slowing down and going dormant and being less competitive this time of year. And so we can still consider the potential for environmental conditions to play a role, but it's important to kind of balance that against the fact that our turf is also potentially dormant and less competitive. But yeah, we did actually do a spot on indicator weeds here on Chat with Green Aggies, and so maybe we can find the video for that and share that here in a little bit. One thing that we see a lot in the wintertime are going to be clovers. Clovers, white clover will start to come up. Clovers or legumes of any kind can be an indicator of nitrogen deficiency in the soil. And so sometimes that can signal to us that during the primary growing season, I may need to bolster my nitrogen fertilization. However, we don't want to fertilize our turf grass areas over the winter months when it's not growing. And I like clover, and I just let it hang out in the wintertime. That's just it. You know, bees like it. It's kind of cute. It helps the soil. And so, you know, another thing I'd say about winter weed control is keep an open mind. You know, maybe you can let some things hang out if they're not, you know, poking holes in your shoes or whatever. Sometimes we get some benefit from having living vegetation in our turf grass areas over the winter to keep our soil healthy and help with rainwater catchment. Okay. I think, let's see. So Margaret asked about soil temperature for lawn burr germination. Ooh, that's a good question. I would have to dig that up a little bit, honestly, to tell you the answer to that one. I can tell you a lot of our winter weeds tend to germinate kind of as Laura's indicated here. We see them germinate when our soil temperatures are between about 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's, you know, the upper inch or so of soil reaching those temperatures, or our ambient temperatures kind of hovering in that 60 to 65 range for several days can signal to us that I'm about to get a bunch of fun winter weeds germinating.
Dr. Bolin,
yes.
I have a question about the germinating temperature. Here in Texas, in the spring and fall, it doesn't matter what your temperature is, you're going to hit that temperature maybe at least once in the day, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is. I mean, that's one thing. I mean, I still am a big fan of recommending soil temperatures. I think there's a little bit of risk with talking too much about dates. We have a mindset a lot of times that weeds are sitting in the soil with a little calendar, and on the 3rd week of September, they're going to pop up out of the ground, and it's a lot more complicated than that. But, you know, Mung Mung's right that, like, with the fluctuations we get in our weather, well, it's 90 degrees today, and it's 50 degrees tomorrow, and, you know, it's rained 6 inches today, and then we don't get rain for 8 weeks. It can make it hard to really fine tune our program, but we just have to try and do the best that we can. And, you know, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
I posted a link to the commercial product that I use to the greenhouse from Syngenta.
Oh yeah, that's awesome.
Look up soil temperatures all the live long day. So I use that thing almost every day this time of year.
Okay. I think, oh yeah, and then Marlene just asked about the use of 20% vinegar to treat all weeds. So here's my little comment. Vinegar, or acetic acid as we call it, as it gets increasingly concentrated, it can be particularly effective on small annual broadleaf seedlings. That's where we see a lot of these organic products be the most effective. This and some of our different kind of like oil-based natural herbicides, etc., all work very similarly, where they kind of break down the integrity of the leaf cuticle and the cell wall. And basically, you know, they'll work to control the vegetation they come into contact with, especially when it's small and vulnerable. Once we have more mature plants, those plants become harder for those chemicals to penetrate. And certainly with perennial plants that have robust root systems, rhizomes, tubers, etc., herbicide or vinegar is not going to move. Like, let's say I just got off another talk where somebody was asking me about nutsedge, and they were asking me, well, can I use vinegar to control the nutsedge? Well, it's not going to move into those little tubers in the soil. You know, it's this, when I pull up a nutsedge and I don't pull up the tuber, a new nutsedge just pops up, okay? And so unless I have a product that's going to translocate and move into that, I'm not going to get the total control that I want. And so I'm all for using organic products, but just we have to be realistic about what they're capable of and what their limitations are. And if you do choose to implement an organic program, you have to really lean on integrated weed management to reduce the need for chemical control. And you have to have a really open mind and be open to the fact that it's just not going to look the same as a landscape that, you know, uses a lot of chemical control. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, be more biodiversity. That's what I tell people. So, man, I took up way more time than I intended. So I'm sorry, Irfan.
You deserve it.
There was a lot of good questions, and I think there was a lot of good information there. So you're good.
So are you ready to do your?
I am ready. Here we go. So talking about the Pollinator Citizen Science Project. Can you all see my screen right now? All right, perfect. So this is a project that's been going on for about 2 years now. Some of you may be involved in this particular project. The purpose of it was there was a few of us, namely Dr. Mike Merchant, who's now retired here at Texas A&M, and Dr. Eric Rebeck at Oklahoma State, that would frequently get the question, what should we plant in our garden to attract pollinators? And the problem was there's very little data, replicated data, especially for southern US, in terms of what plants are considered attractive to pollinators. So one way we thought would go about investigating this question is doing a citizen science project. This, the main project page can be reached at sixleggedaggie.com. And from there, if you go to research and then you select the Pollinator Citizen Science Project, it'll bring you not only to the details of the project, but also some of the summaries of the data and how to get involved. Now, we're almost near the end of this year's season, but essentially what this project has involved is there's three main components for citizen scientists to contribute. One is we have 2 different training videos that are really about how to identify different pollinator groups that we're interested in. So they're both on YouTube. This other one, the second one, is actually a quiz. Then to make sure that you actually watch that video to ensure we have good quality data, that you have some ability to identify the plants and or pollinators and understand the parameters of what we're interested in. So for example, we're asking people to make 60-second observations in a 2 by 2 foot area, flowering area. That's a single type of flower. So that's relatively standardized. Because as you can imagine, if you're looking at a small, a single flowering plant versus an entire tree, there's going to be a major confound there, right? The tree might appear much more attractive, but it might just be that you're looking at a much larger area. So we're trying to standardize some of these parameters and make sure that our citizen scientists are kind of complying by them. And then we have some resources such as an identification guide that can be carried out in the field to, again, help our citizen scientists. And there's the contribution form, which I'm going to show you here, which is a digital form. You can use it on your mobile phone. You can see it actually save records, even if you're offline, and when you're online, it'll upload them. And so anytime our citizen scientists are contributing to this project, they load up this form. And here they'll say, whether this is their first observation, they put in their email, that must match the email they use to pass the quiz. So in that way we can verify that they are certified volunteers. We ask for their location. So this way we can see if there are any differences in slightly different areas of Texas or Oklahoma. The date and the time of day, the temperature when they are actually taking that observation, the Latin name of the plant. So here we have a drop down of a whole lot of different, some of the most common species that so far people have been reporting. Additionally, people can put in other and then actually physically type in a species binomial name, and we can add that into that list afterwards. We ask for how much of the plant is in bloom, the bloom color, and then within 60 seconds actually counting different types of pollinators. So it's really neat. We've gotten an incredible amount of data just in 2019 alone. So if you go back to our project page, you can actually see the current results from 2019. So we're still working on an effective way to analyze this and then provide some information back to consumers. But you can go down here and you'll see that in 2019 alone, we had about 8,000 observations. And you can click plant families and you can see from what plant families all those observations were from and how many observations. So Apocynaceae, you can have my horticulturalists help me out there, had 249 observations, whereas Araceae had only one, right? So there are some that are perhaps Compositae had 1,320. And so on and so forth. So we've broken down also by plant families, with Compositae and Lamiaceae being some of the more common, plant genus, and so on and so forth. And again, we're just starting to kind of, look at some of this data a little bit more closely, where we're looking at, for example, here on the x-axis are our different pollinator categories. We have large bees, medium bees, small black bees, small green bees, all the way to butterflies and moths, and then the flower color. And we can see this pattern where so far it seems like purple might be considered pretty attractive to most pollinators. Now it might be because salvia, giant salvia is considered a highly attractive plant to a lot of pollinators. And there are a lot of observations on salvia. So that salvia might be kind of biasing this data, right? So it might be making it seem like all purple flowers are very attractive, but maybe it's salvia is super attractive, and then there's a bunch of other purple flowers that are not super attractive. So that gives you an idea of just how intricate this data set can get when we actually start to narrow down and look at specifics of attractiveness of different plants. You can already also go down to visits by plant species. You have the average number of visits by each plant species that was observed, with the total number of times that that particular species was observed. So it's important to note here, right? If a plant was only observed once, it's not considered very reliable data, right? Whereas if it's observed, say, 81 times, that's going to be considered a lot more reliable. At the same time, we can go to salvia here, right? So we got Salvia farinaceae, and each of these are hyperlinked to the Wikipedia page of that particular species, so you can quickly learn about some of these different plants that are observed. Now this one here, for example, has 155 observations, appears to be very attractive, right? So on average, within 60 seconds, seeing about 3.5 large bees or bumblebees. Now it is possible, again, that this 155 could have been just from Mung Mung, and maybe she's put it right next to her jujube plants, which we know are very attractive to pollinators. Well, we don't really, I don't know if we actually know that. Mung Mung, do you know, does it attract a lot of pollinators?
Yes, it actually does. They have a lot of flowers.
So Mung Mung's got all of these jujube plants around her house, and then also some Salvia farinaceae, or here's another salvia plant that has a whole, very large number of pollinators. So now we need to make sure that, okay, how many different observers observed on average high numbers, right? So, this is very preliminary still. It might give you a good idea of what is considered attractive, but we still need to dig deeper to provide some very reliable information for everyone. So going on to the current year, we have an incredible amount of data already, about 17,000 observations. We can see from day to day how many observations are submitted, which is kind of fun. We can take a look at the map. We can see that most of those observations are from Texas and from Oklahoma. We do have one observation from the Gulf of Mexico. So observations like these that don't land anywhere, usually it's an artifact of maybe someone didn't actually check their longitude, latitude, and so it landed somewhere that is not correct. So we exclude that, not that entire data point, but we exclude the location information associated with that particular observation. We also have a lot of photos. So our citizen scientists have the option of submitting photos of the flower. So we can go back and verify that the plant identification was correct. And in some cases, there are some interesting insects and pollinators included with those photos, which are really nice to see. So now, just going on to our current summary for this year. So as we're working on this, like I said, we have maybe one more month or so left of the project for this year. And then from there, we're going to have a good sit down and think about what's the best way to analyze this and provide some from deliverables, again, some summaries of how can we determine what's attractive and not. And so this is from today, hot off the press, right? Just over 16,000 contributions from 366 certified volunteers. Of those 366, only about 162 of them are actually providing observations. So we have a lot of people that completed the quiz, but then never went out and started observing plants. So you did like a lot of the training, but then didn't do the fun part. So if you're one of those, I encourage you to get on out there and start doing some observations. And on average, we're getting about 85 observations per day, which is great. And we have verified 326 different plant species that are being observed. So there's a lot of diversity in terms of what's being looked at. And most of our contributions are from master naturalists and from master gardeners. So they are kind of dominating this volunteer process, which is great. It's kind of fun in this project. We have kind of leaderboards, right? So top contributors of all time, and we have top 10 observed plants. And then in the last 20 days, or 21 days, so our observers have another chance to get on that leaderboard, that subsequent time when we send out an update. We have the total number of counts by pollinators. So you can see here predominantly what's being counted are honeybees, although we see some flies and Lepidoptera. So that'd be our butterflies and moths are pretty high up there as well. Now, again, this is just preliminary analysis of the data. This is a honeybee snapshot. In this case, we're only looking at plants that have at least 20 observations from at least 4 different observers. So hopefully we're not running into this problem where, Mung Mung has looked at, the same plant 100 times next to all of our jujubes and looks very attractive, right? Which is not actually the case. Mung Mung isn't doing that. And I hope I'm not coming across as actually accusing Mung Mung of doing that. And so we can see the proportion of observations in which honeybees were observed. We have a few plants that are almost, this one's 100% of the time in which this plant, now I don't know if my horticulturalists, so I have to, these are the Latin names, and I need to go and look at what are some of these common names and what are they. I don't know if any of my horticulturalists are familiar with this one right here, Melochida tomentosa.
Melochia tomentosa
Melochia.
is a native plant. It's just it's it looks very similar to a tiny or mini okra.
Oh, all right.
But
Little
Paul,
purple flowers. Yeah, purple flowers
Yeah.
on it. Summer bloomer. Probably prefers drier conditions, but when I was on the nursery side, we were bringing this into production. So it's a good plant. Probably tops out at about 3 feet tall. Will get wide, and it's sort of a silvery gray foliage.
Okay.
I think the most common name is tea bush, but
okay.
I don't know that that's widely
used.
Yeah.
How about this one, Cuphea hysopifolia?
Oh, that's a very common, very common landscape plant. Some call it little cigar plant.
Yeah.
Huh. All right. Yeah. So here's a nice little snapshot. Like I said, these ones here, now we'll have to see, it's possible, like was mentioned, that this plant prefers drier areas. It's possible that most of these observations are, say, in West Texas. Or in some of our drier regions in which things are being observed. So we kind of need to break these all down by general geographic region. We have the data, but now we need to add that into analysis. Here again is some other kind of preliminary look. Now this is all of the plant species, again, that have at least 20 observations and 4 independent observers. We're looking at the average number of honeybees, other bees, Lepidoptera, or bumblebee visits. And you can see this huge chart right here. This is going out. If you're one of the volunteers, you're going to get an email about this afternoon with this exact PDF. If you're not, you can go to that project page, and at the very bottom, you can actually subscribe to the mail list, so you can at least get the updates and the information related to this. So you can see here, we have the situation where, I got to remind myself, this is the other bees. So you got Monarda didyma, perhaps, that has a whole lot of other bees. And I think this is the green sweat bees, but there might be some photos where we can actually look at them and see what kind of bees those were. We can see here again that we're seeing this nice kind of quite a bit of difference between a lot of different plants. As we move up, there's a lot less visitations to some of these plants up here higher in the list versus lower in the list. And we always have at the very bottom of our PDF a call to action, you can call it, where there are some plants that are basically 5 observations or less away from making it onto our list. So we just need more observations of these particular species. And some of them that might only have 3 independent observers. We need one more person, a different person, to observe one of these plants to make it onto our list. And so that's basically it. If you want to get involved, or again, you want updates, you can go to the project page, sixleggedaggie.com/pollinator-project, or you can scan this QR code and subscribe to our mail list so that you'll either get updates of data, or next year if we do this project again, you can be a part of it.
Things are fun. I kind of feel bad for the plants that the pollinators aren't interested in. It just seems like kind of sad. I feel sorry for the flocks. Doesn't seem like it's getting a lot of love.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. It'd be interesting to know, why. Again, so this is preliminary, so it might be that the areas where they were observed, it just, is not ideal, or it might be that, we had one of the questions is percent bloom, so maybe the few people that are observing it were only observing it when it was very low in bloom. Or maybe it's just not very attracted to pollinators. Maybe it has some other good ecological role or aesthetic value that can add to a garden. Not everything in the garden needs to be attract to pollinators. You might want a good mix of things to increase that diversity.
Hey, Erfang, I apologize.
Apology accepted.
I think it's about 8th on this list, Kufia ignea, and that's the Kufia. That's what normally called cigar plant. And what's the others,
Mexican heather.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's Mexican heather. Yes,
yeah.
Thank you. They're in the same genus, but it's, how could the Mexican heather is in the same as the cigar plant? But anyway, that's just the common name and botanical name, that's all the difference.
Irfan, on those 2 flocks, the other thing is I know Drummondii is an early bloomer during cool season. So you might not have a lot of pollinator action that time of year, so maybe that's why you're not seeing large numbers on those.
There you go.
Yeah, and that's Phlox Drummondii behind my shoulder there. That.
Ah.
It's a really nice flower, but early season. Yep. It's nice to see our Texas superstar Vitex on that list so high.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, second on the list.
Yeah. So I guess it's time for the plant of the week. Woo! Yay!
Yay!
So I apologize for these photographs, which I took in about 3 seconds yesterday at the Fort Worth Botanic Garden, but they do kind of show what I wanted to talk about. But this is Muhlenbergia Lindheimeri, which is my favorite Muhly, and that's something, because there are a lot of great Muhly grasses. You probably are most familiar with Capillaris, the pink Muhly grass, which is blooming right now, and it's really pretty right now too. But I love this one for a couple of reasons, and I think the main thing is just that you can use it in so many ways in the landscape. It's really, really functional. You can use it as a specimen grass. Just a clump of it is very attractive. You can also use it as kind of like a substitute for a shrub. A lot of people think that grasses don't make a very good substitute for shrubs, and you should go ahead and use a shrub. And I'm pro woody shrubs. There's no downside there, except for the cost. So you could use a nice row of this, which is what I was trying to show at the Botanic Garden. as kind of like a substitute for a hedge or a screen or a row of shrubs for less cost. And they'll get 3 to 5 feet tall and stay there, and they won't overgrow that. They're really low maintenance, just once a year, late winter, you want to cut them back for best results. They'll stay nice, but if you don't cut them back, it's not the end of the world. And I think that they just really look good like that. They're also really nice for erosion control. They're typically, Edwards Plateau plants are growing in a kind of a shallow, well-drained soil, and so they usually have a pretty good root system to just function in the area that they're from, and this is certainly true for this plant. It can be used in that way, and also, of course, it can be used in a perennial border where it's really nice. One other wonderful thing about this and other ornamental grasses are that they're just kind of coming into their own right now. The flowers they start blooming earlier in the summer, but the flowers you can see in the small photo are quite attractive, and they stay on the plant all winter. So in the winter, they'll give you that nice, winter interest that's kind of hard to get in the landscape sometimes. This one also has a really attractive, in my opinion, kind of blue-green color and really nice upright growth habit. It's just kind of almost straight up. So that's why I love it so much. It's a Texas superstar. It's easy to propagate from seed like a lot of other nice ornamental grasses and the other muhly grasses, which might also mention seat muhly and bamboo muhly, and there's just so many of them. So it's a standout though in a big beautiful crowd. So that's what I wanted to say about Lindheimer muhly grass.
Well, thank you, Laura.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I am gonna find real quick the link to our survey to complete today. So we are collecting just some very brief information from you guys on your experience in watching this. It takes 5 minutes or less to complete. So if you're willing to help us out and complete this, it would really be beneficial for us to just kind of see how we're doing and look for ways to continue to improve, etc. I had this up and ready to go, and now I'm having difficulty with it.
Oh, no problem, Becky. Just keep looking for it while I show this a short slideshow of this wonderful plant. So take your time. Okay. So any of you who knows what this plant is, please don't be shy and type it in the chat while Dr. Becky, find the link. Oh, he found the link. She found the link. She found the link. She found the link. Yes. Only takes you less than 5 minutes. So today is actually the Chinese Moon Festival, when we eat a lot of moon cakes, and also we use a lot of flowers from this plant, to flavor some of the dessert dishes that we have during the Moon Festival. And as you can see, my background is one of the orange flowered cultivars. And during this, my Chinese social media is inundated with this flower, just inundated. The color, from orange red to golden yellow to whitish to yellow, it just inundated. And if you know this plant, you could actually smell it just from the screen. You could just smell the thing from the screen. I have one flowering in my backyard, and so this is my favorite time of the year to hand weed my garden, because the smell, while I enjoy the sunshine, the smell of the grass, but also the smell of this, it just goes into your nostril. It's just so wonderful. So while I'm telling you this, showing you this slideshow of this wonderful plant, please fill out the survey.
Hung-Wang, I have a question for you about this wonderful plant. How do you use it to flavor dessert? I don't think I've ever
Oh,
That was
so I mean, you can see that you know how they harvest pecan. They just shake the tree, right? So they will I mean, look at how many flowers.
Lots of flowers.
Look at how many flowers on this. So basically during the you know, in a lot of the in the nurseries or something, that you know, they just this, oh, look at this. So they just violently shake the tree, and then you know, they have the they pull the kind of like tarps kind of thing at the bottom to collect all the flowers, and then you soak the flour in the in honey, and then it just preserves, you know, it just preserves the fragrance in it, and then you just use that sweet olive infused honey to flavor anything or everything that you want. So so hopefully by now you have finished filling our survey.
I see at least 2 responses. So
Nice.
Oh wow.
I filled it out twice as a test to make sure it works.
I'm gonna start working on reports tomorrow. It's the beginning of the month, so I'm gonna put some reports.
Okay, all right. I think that's the end of our end of our chat today.